Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I wanted to go over some of the new artwork and lore that was featured in the 10th edition Necron Codex, with my Ogdebek Dynasty Necron army being the biggest army that I have, and with a full playlist dedicated to speculations on the Necron and the major dynasties. I think it's clear that I'm a big fan of the Necrons, so I was really excited to get my hands on this new codex. Of course, I wanted to know about the rules and the detachments so I can play my Ogdebek Necrons, but I also wanted to know about the snippets of lore included as well. There will be countless videos on YouTube discussing the rules, and so something I thought would be interesting to make a video about is the artwork featured in the codex and some of the lore updates, because some of the things that they revealed were honestly surprising. So let's get into it. Let's start with the cover art. At first, when I was giving it a lazy glance, I thought that this was a picture of Imhotep the Stormlord, but it turns out that it's actually just a standard overlord depicted in the picture. This is a slightly different overlord than the miniature that we have, a different pose and a different weapon, so maybe it might be a new model in the future. The carapace is a bronzish color, and the ankh on its chest is black, all of which indicate that this is a Zerekin overlord. Of course it would be. The Zerekin dynasty are the new poster boys of the Necron faction, and GW is pushing them as hard as possible. Pages 15 and 16 of the Codex features this gorgeous piece of art of two Doomsides flying through a field between two gigantic platforms marked with Necron design and crackling with the characteristic green energy found in most Necron art. Here and there we see a floating stone with what looks like a green portal at their center. I love this artwork as it shows the immensity of Necron tier architecture. There is a great piece of artwork on page 29, and it's a whole scene. First, we have two large canoptic constructs in the back. One is a canoptic reanimator, and the other is a huge canoptic wraith of some kind with a dais on its back. There is a noble on the dais looking down at the scene happening below. A tide of canoptic constructs and warriors approach on the ground from the back. We can clearly see a Scorpic destroyer in the front, scarabs in the air, reanimators in the back. On the left, we see two silver Necrons with blue markings. The Cryptek in the back holds a resurrection orb toward what appears, by its lack of crest and flat shoulder armor, to be a fallen warrior that seems to be cowering before the procession. The Lich Guard in the front points at a golden necrodermis colored Necron, a Cryptek by its singular eye. Next to it is another golden-skinned Necron, not a Cryptek, but perhaps a apprentice, who has a golden canoptic construct on its shoulders. It seems to be either repairing or breaking open a Necron warrior's head, and crackling green energy is shown underneath. The Necron whose head is being worked on is silver, like the approaching Necrons are. By the blue symbols on their gold carapace, these two Necrons are of the Nihilakh dynasty. I'm not sure if a confrontation is happening between two different dynasties or if they are all Nihilakh Necrons interacting with each other, but being that all of the Necrons in the image have a blue mark in their scheme, and there is another Lich Guard standing at attention behind the golden Cryptek instead of in a defensive posture, it's likely that they are all Nihilakh Necrons interacting with each other. Most interesting to me is the Necron at the bottom of the page. Look at its face in comparison to the Necron that's having its head tampered with. Its face is remarkably skull-like. This proves my theory that I stated in my Necron deep dives, that Necrons are wearing necrodermis masks over necrodermis bones. This is a great piece of artwork that I personally haven't seen before, and I love how much is going on within the picture. Page 32 shows a Necron tomb world, and again it illustrates how expansive these worlds are. A lot of low, blocky structures, occasionally broken up by tall, monolithic towers. Many areas glow with a green energy from within, and you can see a tribute-like statue on top of some of the towers, like this sitting noble or this figure in an offering-like gesture. We have what looks like a smaller version of the Necron monolith hovering over the surface of the world, and a few blackstone spires suspended in the air. But what really caught my eye were the Necron figures in this piece. These are clearly nobles of some sort. There is a very cool looking transport platform of some kind that has just delivered a noble and what I assume to be their bodyguard to an elevated location overlooking the rest of the tomb world. Just a small detail that I noticed, the platform appears to have shield veins on its side, those blade-like fins that you see. On miniatures such as the tomb blades, shield veins are an extra form of protection, and so I guess these blades offer protection to those who are riding on the platform. The primary noble is either riding on a canoptic machine or are themselves half canoptic with a spider-like leg arrangement similar to Zera's. A really interesting detail is the crest. There seems to be a semicircle crest that goes from one shoulder to the other behind the noble's head, and it's serrated like a saw blade. This is my first time seeing this in Necron art. We don't have it on any miniatures that GW has created yet, but I love the design and I hope we get it in miniature form. Standing a few steps ahead of the noble are two figures with the same shoulder-to-shoulder crest, and they seem to be carrying void scythes. Ahead of them are two more nobles with the regular head crest that we see on Necron lords, though the one on the left looks more like a standard lord, and the one on the right has a tall crest similar to the Necrons that drive the battle barges of the Necrons. Ahead of them and standing to the side are a group of what I assume to be more nobles. One of the figures standing in the front has his arms crossed in a Necrontyr greeting that we've seen in other artwork. The figures in the back might be Lichguard. I think I can make out their shields. But the last thing that I found interesting in this art piece was the banners. This is something that I desperately want GW to create for the Necrons, standard bearers. That's what I think these crescents on poles are. They remind me of the Egyptian style banners that you would see with the Tomb Kings or with other miniature ranges inspired by Egypt. Since Necrons already have this Egyptian-esque theme, they might as well have those kind of banners as well. Pages 36 and 37 of the Codex have by far the most interesting artwork in the entire Codex. Not only that, but it has some really interesting lore. But before we get to the lore, let's begin with the center image on the pages. Possibly the most shocking art in the book, because for the first time in over 20 years, GW has revealed what the Necrontyr actually looked like when they were flesh and blood beings. The first thing to note is that upon closer inspection, this might actually be a mask that was worn by the Necrontyr. The eyes are hollow and there are canoptic scarabs coming out of them, but the face itself is not a skull because the nose is fully formed and projecting outward. Still though, the face of the mask likely imitates the Necrontyr face. From this mask, we can see that the Necrontyr had long, narrow faces and wide mouths. This is especially pleasing for me to see because not too long ago, I shared my custom Necrontyr Pharaon sculpted by No Sculptor, and two features I really wanted it to have were a long face and a wide mouth, and this interpretation was based off of their mask. So, it seems like I had the right idea. It's also really gratifying that my theory that the Necron faces are actually masks was confirmed yet again in the Codex. More evidence that this art is of a mask is that the forehead has a blade-like crest coming from it. There's actually a trinity of masks which show the blade-like crest from the side. These three masks indicate that the mask being shown is the mask of the Silent King, meaning this is how the Silent King looked as a Necrontyr. And it makes sense that this art is shown in the center of these pages because the art and lore around it is about Zarek and the things that he has done. The 2 pages feature circles of artwork, and so I'm going to go over each of them. The first circle of artwork shows the Silent King standing before a green wall, which may be a crowd or a construction of some kind. In the background, we can see white floating pyramids. The first thing that can be immediately recognized is that this is not Zarek as a Necron, but Zarek as a Necron tier. He is shown with a billowing cape, with his crown, and with his scepter, which is of a different design than the scepter he has now. The floating pyramids in the back are white, not silver, nor are they glowing with green energy or bristling with weaponry. This image is of a time before biotransference. The second image is also of Zarek as a Necron tier. Here he is clothed in a gown with his dynastic Ankh on the front of it. The Ankh is different than the Ankh he bears on his chest as a Necron. I went over in my Necron deep dives how dynastic Ankhs change over time to illustrate changes in the dynasty's history. In the background above him, you can see flyers of some kind, which appear to be the precursors to the Doom Scythe. They are much thinner and less imposing in this depiction, perhaps suggesting that they weren't used as vehicles of war yet. Again, this art depicts a time before biotransference. There's a third image featured on the same page. This image is of a figure that looks like a Necron at first glance, but might actually be a fully armored Necron tier encased in necrodermis. The reason I suggest this is because it doesn't look like how a Necron would look. We definitely see segments of armor on the arms, for example, but if you look at the elbow, it's covered by another piece of armor instead of it being a robotic joint that it would be if it was a Necron. The figure's neck is also not skeletal and robotic as well, just armored. By the triple crest on the head, this is the Silent King, but in this art it looks more like a helmet than just a mask or a crown. The figure is looking at an orb. If I were to guess, I would say that this artwork depicts Zarek in full armor looking at the Necron tier's star. Why? Because he's being shown the Satan feeding off of their star as Gorod. This depicts him, in my opinion, detecting the Satan. The next image shows the Silent King in full armor, almost affectionately cradling the dead body of a Necron tier in his arms. We see the loop of armor going from one shoulder to the next, perhaps being a sign of Pharaon status. And now that I think about it, that loop of armor might be related to the kind of loop of armor that the Praetorians have, where it allows them to fly. But that's just, my guess in this image. This image is very powerful. It's very sad. The body that he's holding is like crumpled, it's clearly deceased, and it's like dark and it's just dead, and he's looking down at it, and it's a very sad looking image, very profound for someone who knows the lore of the Necrons and the fact that they lived very short lives full of pain and sickness. And so it's very interesting art indeed, and I think it's one of my favorite pieces in this book. The image after that shows an unarmored but cloaked Silent King. His scepter is on the ground, and his arm is reaching out toward what looks like either an opening or an energetic being. The last image shows a figure that could be assumed to be either Zarek or a Necron tier reaching up toward the stars. Unlike the previous images where the figure is dark, this figure is white and seems to be aflame. This, I suggest, pictorially illustrates the process of biotransference. Now, there are snippets of lore around these circles of art that would at first glance appear to be describing what is going on in each of the pictures. However, that's not the case. While the images show Zarek before biotransference, the paragraphs of lore around the images share what Zarek has been up to since biotransference. It's interesting too because this part of the book is directly after the section of lore about the Zarekian dynasty. In that section, it says that only Zarek knows why he left our galaxy and why he returned. The paragraphs of lore on the pages following this section on the Zarekian dynasty go over why he left the galaxy and why he came back. The lore is quite interesting, and it's told from the perspective of a Necron, perhaps one of the Zarekan dynasty, because of the depth and knowledge of the information it shares. Only someone who was with Zarek would know this information, as even those awakened from his own dynasty that remained in our galaxy didn't know why he left, but just held on to faith that it was for the best. So the first paragraph of the lore talks about mantles, or periods of time in Necron history. It says, as the first mantle ended, it was Zarek who unified the Necrontyr peoples, bringing them into the second mantle of existence. These two mantles of existence, I think, are referring to the expansion from the Necrontyr homeworld, with the first expansion happening before Zarek was Silent King, and the second expansion during the war in heaven against the Old Ones, during which he was the Silent King. It goes on to talk about how it was Zarek who accepted the offer of the Star Gods, which turned the Necrontyr into the Necrons, and how it was Zarek who turned against the Star Gods as well. In this lore, the war in heaven is referred to as the War of Aeons. After the War of Aeons is won, Zarek commands his people to sleep, to slumber through the death throes of their enemies. This is of course referring to the Great Sleep. It says that Zarek sailed into the sky beyond skies to ward the borders of his people's sleep, to cow the distant realms of existence, and prepare for the awakening. Now that last part we can understand. He was preparing for the Great Awakening of the Necron Empire. However, what do they mean when they say sky beyond skies? Is that referring to outer space? Because, after all, we did receive lore in 9th edition that the Silent King left our galaxy on what was understood as a self-imposed exile. It says he sailed to the sky beyond skies to ward his people's sleep. Ward means to protect, and so this journey was undertaken in part to protect the Necron Empire. Then it says to cow the distant realms of existence. To cow something means to scare someone into submission. Distant realms of existence in this situation likely means other galaxies. So, to summarize this in basic terms, Zarek commands the Necrons to sleep, then he left the galaxy to protect the Necron Empire, to scare other peoples in other galaxies into submission, and to prepare for the Great Awakening in this galaxy. The next bit of lore is very juicy. It says, basically, that while the Necrons slept in this galaxy, Zarek and the portion of his dynasty that he took with him were out conquering other galaxies during a period of time that is called the Third Mantle of Existence. He trampled barbarous empires, he soothed uncivilized realms of horror and madness. Victory and tribute did he achieve and receive and win. In this way, Zarek the Silent King acquired new territory for the Necron Empire in other galaxies, which is crazy to think about. The Silent King has carved out territories for his peoples in other galaxies. He subjugated populations in other galaxies. This is actually amazing lore to find out. The lore goes on to say that there was a rupture in the realm empiric that tested the dynasties. This is referring to the creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum and our own galaxy, the divide in real space that tore the galaxy in half. It goes on to say that the Silent King released the usurpers, the Technomandrites, from their prisons, and they gratefully constructed the realm-spanning matrix based on Zarek's design, a crown of nodal matrices to the eternal realm. The Technomandrites were a cabal of cryptex who at one time stood against the Triarch and were responsible for creating immensely destructive weaponry, selling them to the highest bidder amongst the Necron dynasties. In previous editions, it was stated that the location of the Technomandrites were unknown, so it's great to have an update on their status, namely that they were imprisoned and were then released by the Silent King soon after the creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum. The crown of nodal matrices is likely referring to the Pariah Nexus, whose function is to sever real space from the warp, which of course helped the Necron peoples against their enemies. The next paragraph of information talks about the fourth mantle of existence, the Great Awakening. The Necron dynasties begin to awake, but they don't acknowledge all that Zarek has done for them. It says that their sleep was troubled by vermin and the last curse of the gods, and it says that Zarek mourned what has happened to his peoples. It says that none loved his peoples more than the Silent King. The next paragraph speaks about how the Silent King banished a dynasty from existence completely. It says that the Rahaptemet dynasty claimed to love the people and hate only the Silent King, but that the Silent King is the code, and the code is the people, which basically means that by being against the Silent King, they were also deemed to be against the people. And therefore, with sorrow, Zarek banished the dynasty beyond the gates of Varl from existence. The last paragraph states that the purity of the eternal realm is nearly done because the nodes are spread across every heaven. Here it mentions that his plans have been interrupted by a pretender species who has tainted Zarek's great gift. It says that if such lesser species couldn't understand the magnitude of Zarek's gifts, then he would banish them from existence. It finishes by saying that the territories won by Zarek and the other galaxies await him and his peoples, but it's only after the final mantles of existence fall away completely will his peoples know just what he has in store for them. Something that immediately caught my attention about this paragraph was the mention of a pretender species. Who is this phrase referring to? Pretender species. Initially, I would think humanity, but then I thought pretenders pretending to be what? Pretending to be Necrons? This led me to think that narrative perspective was referring to the Mechanicus, which is still technically a part of humanity, and so it's referring to humanity as a whole, but specifically referring to the Mechanicus as a pretender species. And if you think about it, the Necrons calling the Mechanicus, and I guess humanity as a proxy, a pretender species actually makes sense. Because Magladroth, the Void Dragon, is underneath or within the planet Mars, right? And it's because Magladroth is there, because of their energy and presence, that the Martians developed into the peoples that they would later become, where they start worshiping machines and they worship the Omnissiah and they start replacing their bodies with mechanics. This is because of the influence of Magladroth, which is a Satan, which is a captured star god, right? So the Necrons calling the Mechanicus a pretender species actually makes sense because it's only under the influence of the Void Dragon that the Martians became what they did, which is interesting. These snippets of lore are extremely interesting and important for a few reasons. One, it talks about the Necron history from the perspective of a Necron. Almost all the lore that we have on Necrons has come from either the perspective of humans in the setting interpreting Necron history, or the perspective of the Eldari. We call the war in heaven the war in heaven because that's what the Eldar called it. According to the Necrons, this was called the War of Aeons. We get the Necron name for things in this text, the realm of Empiric or the realm Empiric being the warp, the mantles of existence being the periods of time in Necron history. The second reason it's interesting is because it's a load of propaganda sprinkled with some truth. The perspective talks about Zarek as if he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. He is called the Scholar King, the Nemesis to those who stand against his peoples. It's said that he only did the things he did in other galaxies for his people humbly. Meanwhile, we already know that the Zarekan dynasty looks at the universe with a sense of possession and ownership. It's emphasized that he banished the Rahaptemet dynasty with sorrow. They're making Zarek seem like he's the good guy who only wanted the best for his people, which is not entirely untrue, but there's a little bit more to go along with that. It's a little bit deeper than that. Last but not least, this lore is interesting because it doesn't mention at all three things that we have been taught to believe about the Necrons thus far. First, that they are trying to return to flesh and blood beings. It doesn't mention that at all. And if you think about it, doesn't that make sense? Why would the Necrons want to return to being living beings again? To become living beings is to eventually die again. As Necrons, they are immortal, which is what they wanted from the old ones since the beginning. So why would their goal be to return to the flesh? Another thing it doesn't mention is that the Silent King exiled himself from the galaxy as a form of penance. It says very clearly that he left the galaxy to conquer other galaxies for the Necrons. He left with a series of objectives in mind. Lastly, it says nothing about the reason the Silent King returned to the galaxy being because of the Tyranids. It says simply that he returned knowing the Great Awakening would happen. I think that GW is slowly moving away from the lore that the Necrons are trying to become living beings again, or at least that is Zarek's plan. Instead, I think they are moving toward his plan to defeat the remaining forces of the Old Ones and have the Necron Empire be the rulers of the Eternal Realm, or physical reality itself and all life itself. The thing is, I think we were already told this by GW and we all misunderstood it. I mentioned in a video that I had made in the beginning of 9th edition that has long since been deleted from my channel, that the video that Games Workshop released to announce the return of the Silent King at the beginning of 9th edition was a bit suspicious. The voice who narrated the video was speaking from the perspective of someone who knew of Zarek, but the voice itself was not Necron or robotic-like. The images were also odd as well. The Silent King was shown in his robotic Necron form, and the two other figures that might have been the other two figures of the Triarch or Lichguard that stood at his side were shown in Necron form as well, but almost everyone around him was shown in a form that was not Necron at all, but was actually quite human looking. Their emaciated bodies were shown kneeling before the Silent King before they were shown transformed into hulking figures carrying war blades and parts of their bodies glowing with Necron-like energy. These figures were shown towering over other human-like figures who were reacting terrified to the world around them. Lastly, the script in the video is also weird. The narrator says in the beginning that there was once a king beloved by his people who broke the boundary of mortality. He freed us from death and granted us vengeance. It then says that in his wisdom, he sailed into the lightless void. The narrator then says that now we stand under the light of ancient stars, surrounded by frail newborn empires, but the stars whisper of our king's return. At first, it's easy to assume that this figure is a Necron talking about the return of Zarek to the galaxy. That is, until we think about it a little deeper. In the beginning of the video, the narrator refers to the Silent King as a king who was beloved by his people. Then at the end, after he and his people are saved from death and transformed, he refers to the Silent King as our king. The narrator says that in his wisdom, the Silent King sailed into the lightless void. How would someone who is a Necron know that when the Necrons were commanded into the Great Sleep before he left? As far as we know, only the Zarekan dynasty knew that he left the galaxy. The others assumed such because as the dynasties awoke, they found that he was not leading his own dynasty. I think that the perspective of the narrator isn't of a Necron in our galaxy awakening after the Great Sleep and telling a story of the Silent King. I think this story is told from the perspective of someone in one of the civilizations that the Silent King subjugated in another galaxy. If looked at from this perspective, the video is actually a story of the Silent King saving a civilization of people, leaving them to come back to our galaxy, and of them awaiting his return. This almost directly corresponds to the lore we received in 10th edition about how the Silent King claimed territories in other galaxies for the Necrons to eventually rule, and of those civilizations awaiting his return. The lore for the Triarch Praetorians also supports this theory. Just like the Silent King, the Triarch Praetorians didn't participate in the Great Sleep. Instead, they tried to protect what assets the Necron Empire still had from the Eldari, and they traveled throughout the galaxy, teaching primitive cultures the dynastic codes of the Necron tier, reshaping those cultures to fit their own ideals. Though some of these peoples would be destroyed by the Eldari, some would survive, living by the Necron tier dynastic codes and having Necron archaeotech, meaning that there are other species living by dynastic codes within our own galaxy. And if that's possible, then it's definitely possible that there are species in other galaxies living by dynastic codes taught those ways by Zarek. In the section on the Zarekan dynasty in the 10th edition Codex, the rivals of the Zarekan dynasty were hesitant to believe that the Silent King would return, but when they saw that even the Triarch Praetorians fought for the Zarekan dynasty, even against other Necrons, they reconsidered their hesitation to believe. So, the major update to the lore of the Necrons is that the Silent King's history and his endeavors are given more depth, and according to it, the Silent King has acquired territory in other galaxies for the Necron Empire to rule. Overall, I think that these updates are very cool, super interesting, and they put a unique twist on the Necron lore. As far as the quantity of lore, no codex will be better than the 8th edition codex in regards to the amount of lore a Necron codex gives us, unless it came before 8th edition. Every edition since 8th edition, GW has decreased the amount of foundational lore they put into their codexes. The codexes have become more and more just rulebooks, and it honestly sucks. But this is one of the reasons why you keep old codexes of factions that you want to play for a long time, because you keep that lore. I mean, the new 10th edition codex doesn't even have explanations for things like warriors or Triarch Praetorians like they did in 8th edition or even in the 9th edition codex. Every codex is just less and less information, but the trade-off is that they give information about the story and how it pushes forward. So I guess it's okay, you know. In regards to who is the artist behind the artwork that is featured in the Necron Codex, I have a creeping suspicion that it was Jamie Martinez. On Instagram, they're known as Debana Works, and I think it's their artwork because of artwork that they did for 9th edition. It looks quite similar in style and aesthetic. I'm not sure of that. I'm not certain, but I think that it was Jamie Martinez who made the artwork. I don't know why Games Workshop doesn't give credit to the artists that make this amazing artwork, but I love the artwork so much. And if I'm wrong, I want to be, someone let me know in the comments below. But regardless, Jamie Martinez does amazing Necron artwork, and he made a lot of the work that you see in 9th edition Codex. So it might, be his artwork featured in the 10th edition codex as well. Either way, it was amazing artwork in this book. It mixed a lot of the old artwork with some of the newer artwork, and that's always great to see. And the lore update was rather interesting, though the lack of lore and information on the Necrons in this codex is upsetting, to be honest. Also, they keep disrespecting the Ogdebek dynasty. Every edition since 8th edition, in 8th edition, they had a whole section to themselves, and now they only had a sentence. They were only mentioned in a sentence once in this codex, and that's just disrespectful. As a Necron dynasty that is facing humanity being the closest dynasty to Terra, you would think that there would be more artwork of the Ogdebek dynasty. You'd think that there would be miniatures showcasing their paint scheme in the books like there were in 8th edition. But right now I'm just rambling because I'm upset because the Ogdebek dynasty is great. And if you want to know more about the Ogdebek dynasty, I made a playlist of Necron dynasties that I went over. Please check it out. I'm really about to start commissioning artists that I usually commission just to create artwork of the Ogdebek dynasty, because apparently Games Workshop thinks that they're not important when they are the closest Necron threat to Terra. Like, Okay, let me chill out. I'm just very passionate about the dynasty that I play, all right? But basically, that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content. Also, share this video with anyone that you might think will be interested in watching it. It really helps the channel out. Without anything else to be said, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects, the future is successor, and glory to Anathrosis.